Okay, hi, my name is Ricky Garni, and the name of my poem is In This Canoe. In this canoe, we are safe. We are safe on the beach in this canoe. At night, alone in this canoe, we are safe. There might be the sound of crabs scuttling and dogs barking and wolves howling in the mountains. Not on the beach, where we are, safe in this canoe. So safe, so alone, this canoe. We have a gun. We have mosquito netting. We have a book. We have a signal flare, a candle. We have everything we have ever wanted. Now we can relax. We don't have to worry anymore. Everything is fine. Nothing will happen. Not in this canoe. Not with the abundance we have in this canoe. Not with the solitude we have in this canoe. In this canoe, I've never been happier than I am in this canoe. I don't know why it is, but somehow in it, as we are in this canoe, I don't feel safe. I don't feel safe at all. I don't feel safe in this canoe. Do you? What inspires me to write poetry is odd. I've been thinking about this for the last few days, and I think two things in general. One is by looking back at what I've written in the last few months, I noticed that it was often about either misunderstanding words or the oddities of words and phrases or observations, sometimes as what a child would see and what a child might possibly misinterpret. Examples I can give you were, for example, is Moss Moose. Why do we call it the Dave Brubeck Quartet when much of what you hear is Paul Desmond's saxophone? Would ice cream taste good in an igloo? Do palm trees read the weather reports? Can you eat a raspberry-colored sweater? Was a bowling ball modeled after a bald man? Did anyone ever kiss Chairman Mao? Essentially, things that I just stop in my reading, no matter what it is, and very seldom is it poetry. They just sort of inspire me to think about something slightly off the axis, about something that is very much on the axis. In terms of inspiring things that I read, I often find that I am best suited to be inspired when I read something that I thought wasn't permissible. Some sort of style of a writer, someone like Edward Gorey, the first time I read him, and I felt as though I didn't think you could do that. And I felt like, in a way, he had silently sort of reached out and said, it's fine, go ahead, you can write whatever you want. This poem, Canoe, is a little dark, which is unusual for me, because I usually keep things rather jaunty, but I feel like it's often hard for me to process pleasure, or even embrace pleasure in any way. I think recently, in the last several years, it's become more and more typical of more and more people on a global level. Essentially, we're always waiting for the other shoe to drop. I find, though, for me, that's always been a condition. If I get a great job or something, my first thought is, well, I like this job. Can I do this job? What if someone better comes along to take this job from me? That sort of thing. I feel very strongly about those who experience this more and more often with the advent of the web. I feel like the web is a beautiful, terrible thing, but somehow it can amplify and increase the level of fear and mostly anxiety that we have. When I wrote In This Canoe, I wrote it specifically because I was thinking about what is the answer, what is the response, or how do you get away from this sort of feeling? And I thought, I always thought of the canoe as the anti-internet, the way of just sort of retreating from all things cybernetic, and is more or less a piece of tranquility and beauty and simplicity of being on a lake or something like that. But I feel like when we sort of reach the global connection of unhappiness, I read and experienced myself, more and more people sort of wake up in the middle of the night for fear of just sort of a global annihilation. I don't think I suffered any more than anyone else, probably actually on the lighter side of average, but still did have an effect on me. And I felt as though I tried to express this in this poem, that the basic elements of life, which are love, romance, family, adventure, tranquility of a lake, the sound of an oar, might eventually lose their efficacy, their ability to give us pleasure. And I worried basically that something as simple as a canoe would lose its power and its beauty and become sort of a discarded relic, no longer serve any purpose. Someday we'd even forget what the purpose was in the first place. Okay, the process I use on a technical level is that, and forgetting about inspiration for a moment, is just essentially the typewriter. And I love typewriters. I've got a sort of embarrassing number of antique typewriters that I use, all functional. And essentially I find something about the mechanics and the sound, the sort of the music of typewriter very inspiring. Oddly enough, even though I talk about sound there, I find that I can't write well if I'm distracted. So I would say 90% of my writing is done before 6 in the morning or after midnight, on either side of the dial in terms of being awake. But on that level, I find it, I'm inspired by the music of it because I'm a musician, but I also find as though, sadly, since I've been doing this, which about the last 5 years or so, I've actually been writing poetry for close to 50 years, but for the last 5 years or so of doing a typewriter, it adds to my burden because I have to go from the typewriter to, essentially installing in a computer and then formatting and all that sort of stuff. But it's much more pleasurable for me, so it's worth the extra step. But that's essentially just the mechanics of it. I've often recommended that people actually don't read poetry in order to write poetry. I'm not saying don't read poetry. I'm saying in order to write poetry, I don't think you should read primarily the poetic verse. I think that better inspiration can often come from launching pads that are utterly akimbo or utterly misaligned from poetry itself in some way. I often read things like, and this, I don't mean this to sound silly or pompous, but truly, like Johnson's Dictionary or Emily Post's book of Blue Book of Usage. I know people who read books on microbiology and history, things like that, because I think the essence of being inspired is being inspired by ideas or combinations of words that aren't necessarily conceived or constructed in a way to be poetic, but can be reshaped and remodeled into something that is quite beautiful and poetic. As far as the editing process, I always think that you should edit out loud, no matter what. For the musicality, for the rhythm, for the words, to make sure you've written the things that you think you actually written. And because we can all get rather sloppy about that sort of thing. And if you've rewritten something 5 or 10 times, you often forget, your eyes do not correspond with what is actually written on the page, or your brain doesn't process it properly, and you'll read what you think is there rather than what is actually there. But for the musicality, typewriters, for the musicality, read out loud. In a way, the best thing to do is sort of attack the poem with the notion that everything that was written, every word, every stanza, every construction was done very, very deliberately. And try to essentially walk into the deliberate process as much as you can in order that you might interpret what was put there with great intention. I think that, like any other muscle, it needs to be exercised. And I think the more you read, in this case, I'm not talking about writing, but in terms of reading and interpreting, the more you read from the more varied sources, stronger your poetic muscles can become. So I strongly recommend reading as diverse a scope of poems and poets from as many centuries and many cultures as you can. I think that'll make the process of interpreting easier. And before you do that, be willing, when you start to read a poem, to let go of it if you feel like it's not going to speak with you. I mean, in a way, I'm saying contradictory things. Be patient with it in a sense, but also be patient with it only to an extent. As they've said about fiction, there are more extraordinary poems out there that could possibly read in a lifetime. So stick with the extraordinary. Okay, I hate to break the rules here, but I thought about this for a while, and I will try to condense this as much as I can. But it's almost like shout-outs in a sense, and I like doing that. I'm thinking of 4 poems rather than 1. Again, apologies in advance for breaking the rules. But I found a unifying factor to them. Those poems are Apple by Denise Hamel, My Son the Man by Sharon Olds, I Could Have Been That Man by James Tate, and Love Is Not All by Edna St. Vincent Millay, who's obviously the oldest of the bunch. The others are contemporary and for the most part alive, although James Tate just died a year or so ago. Is the reason what I think of in terms of exemplary, and that's a very difficult word to sort of struggle and grasp in a way, is very, very personal. For me, what makes these 4 poems exceptional, exemplary poems is I truly get the chills every time I read them. 3 of the 4 are some of my favorite writers, and only one is the kind of poem I read myself, so I don't necessarily identify with it. In fact, the other 3 I don't identify with stylistically at all. But as for the why, and what makes them exemplary, to break it down, first of all, they're all 4 about love, which is not unusual, I suppose. 2 are about the love of a child, and as a dad, that makes me sort of weep, and it does give me chills. 3 have to do with the absence of love or its frailty, and 2 are narratives that contain a bit of sad humor to them. 2 are slightly elegiac or didactic, but in terms of common threads, themes, or focus, it's hard to say that they do have that. But I think the power that they have within them is enough for many people, including myself, to be jarred, to be stricken, to be chilled by the emotion of the piece. And again, oddly enough, I think one of the reasons that I'm as struck as I am by these poems is that I'm not identifying with these poets as human beings, as poets, as stylists, in terms of their approach or content. And that makes it even more extraordinary for me, because I feel as though that's what you really want, is someone who transcends all the things you normally look for, or the friends you might seek out, and instead they're apart from that, and yet still can chill you to the bone. So I recommend those specific poems, and in general, but I think also specific to those authors. If you get a chance, please read all 4: Denise Hamel, Sharon Olds, James Tate, and the St. Vincent Millay. Yes, I'd like to give a shout out to Alan Gerganis, who is a writer here in the South, in North Carolina, where I live, and I just saw him the other day. He's been writing for a goodly amount of time, many, many years. He wrote the Oldest Living Confederate Widow Tells All some years ago, and he's an extraordinary stylist and an exemplary poem of a human being. So I'd like to say hi to Alan.